Have you ever wondered why so little is known about the Nubian pharaohs that ruled all of Egypt around 700 BC? Is this merely coincidence? Was there a lack of accomplishment, importance, or significance surrounding their reign? Or is this absence of information contrived, premeditated, or purposeful? Is history being ignored or whitewashed? If so, why and by whom? Is there a religious connection? Is there a racial consideration? Or is it both? Where are we in the religious discourse pertaining to these rulers? Is it not significant that of the 4 pharaohs specifically mentioned by name in the Bible, Taharka, a pharaoh of this dynasty, is one of them? Furthermore, is it not also equally significant that Taharka is mentioned twice by name in the Old Testament and was interacting directly with the Hebrews, 2 Kings 19:9 and Isaiah 37:9? Is the inference of significance pertaining to this dynasty wishful thinking, or the desires of uninformed pundits? Absolutely not. Now let us roll back time and turn our attention to circa 700 BC, a historical and holy time, a time when the Bible was being written, as evidenced by the prophecies and teachings of Jonah, Amos, Hosea, Micah, and Isaiah. It was a time when the great Nubian pharaohs of the Egyptian 25th dynasty protected their brethren, the Hebrew people, throughout their 100-plus year reign. A time of brother helping brother. For as the sons of Ham protected the sons of Shem, we find a historical paradigm of connection between the descendants of 2 brothers inextricably linked by God through his covenant with each son of Noah. The actions on the part of the Nubians were ordained by God.
Around the period of time the Old Testament was written, one has to understand that perhaps one of the most powerful countries in the world at that time was Egypt, or Kemet. Egypt during that time was ruled by a series of black pharaohs from Nubia. That was the 25th dynasty.
Why is this important? First and foremost, to adjust historical accuracy and to correctly link periods of human evolution. This missing chapter is critical in understanding man's anthropological, historical, religious, and social evolution. In our Western culture, the contributions of black people are tied directly to slavery in the Americas and its aftermath. Every other group's nationality and culture have well-documented archival information that provides clear and concise connections and links to their forefathers.
We have this painting of Nubians as somehow barbaric, somehow less civilized than Egypt. But in fact, what we know from the depictions of Nubian kings and the elite, the tombs, like the tombs that we're finding at Tombos, we know that Nubians led a sophisticated lifestyle, every bit as sophisticated as Egypt during the time of the Nubian dynasty.
So the 25th dynasty actually marked a major turning point in the history of the Nile Valley.
It's becoming more and more apparent that Egypt is Nilotic. It's the Nile River Valley, and the Nile River Valley not only flows from Nubia to Egypt into the Mediterranean, but the migration of population was northwards. So the point I'm making is that where does Egypt begin? In all likelihood, it begins in Nubia.
I'd like you to consider the following points of anthropological and scientific fact. The African continent is the birthplace of mankind. The human race is of African origin. Man's evolution was Nilotic, progressing from south to north. Since ancient Africa was a savanna, man's rudimentary foundation of civilization started here. Recent DNA research by the National Geographic have proved conclusively that man evolved from the Great Rift Valley and parts of Tanzania. It is without question that many of the early Egyptian rulers were black.
My wife and I took a trip to Egypt, and one of the highlights of our trip was to go to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. And in the museum, they had artifacts from every dynasty in Egyptian history, with the exception of the 25th dynasty. In fact, they skipped the 25th dynasty and went directly to the 26th and 27th dynasty, the Greek dynasty, the Ptolemy dynasty. Now, I wonder, why was that such? Well, in the 25th dynasty, there's no dispute that that was a dynasty that was controlled, and the pharaohs were all Nubians, black Africans. But yet and still, this dynasty was totally skipped and not acknowledged in the Egyptian Museum.
When you look at Egyptology and you go to any book on Egyptology, the first thing you will find omitting is Ham. And that's odd, because Egypt is called the land of Ham in antiquity. But you do not hear that mentioned in Egyptology. Why is that? Because if you mention that there was a Ham and this land of Egypt was called the land of Ham, then the pharaohs were black.
Understand that from the earliest dynastic periods, Nubia was always targeted and a matter of conquest for the Egyptian pharaohs because of its rich natural resources of gold and food from its fertile valleys. And as such, Nubia, or Nubians, often controlled Egypt. At times, it was very much a part of Egypt.
I see two major contributions of the Nubian dynasty of Egypt. The first is in reunifying Egypt against a threat from competing Libyan dynasts in the Nile Delta, and to face a larger threat from the Assyrian Empire. The second thing that I see that's important about the Nubian dynasty is that they created a new civilization based to some extent on Egypt, but intertwining and blending Egyptian elements with Nubian elements, forging a new culture that lasted for 1,000 years, which is a pretty good run for civilizations in terms of world history.
King Pi. By 4800 BC, the Nubian Empire was established in northeastern Africa in the area which is today known as Sudan. Later, the capital cities of the Nubian Empire would be Kerma, Napata, and Meroe, and the empire would go through a number of phases of development over thousands of years. By 744 BC, an African leader named King Pi, who also was known as Payankkai, came to power as the ruler of Nubia. King Pi governed Nubia from the capital city of Napata, which was located on the west bank of the Nile River. The Great King Pi. Now the African Empire of Egypt were Nubia's neighbors to the north and subsequent to some Egyptian incursion onto Nubia territory. King Pi launched a military campaign against Egypt. The Nubians' armies swept across Egypt, took control of the cities of Memphis, Karnak, and eventually the entire region of Upper Egypt in the south. Later, the city of Hermopolis in Middle Egypt fell. King Pi would completely surround an Egyptian city, limit access to food supplies, and demand that they submit to Nubian rule. If the city declined the offer, the Nubians would attack. And so, using this strategy, city after city fell under Nubian control. This great African king was also extremely keen for his troops to perform purification before they engaged in war. He was known to deliver the following command to his armies: When ye arrive, ye shall enter into the water, ye shall bathe in the river. The Nubians believed that all warfare was conducted on two planes. The first was the physical, and the second, and more important, was the spiritual. King Pi continued to move north, eventually taking the city of Thebes and the entire region of Lower Egypt in the north. Once Pi conquered the region, he went back to Nubia and allowed the defeated rulers to govern the territory as long as they paid tribute to Nubia. And so, the great King Pi established the 25th dynasty of Egypt and established the Nubian Empire as both the rulers of Nubia and Egypt. Their power over the region would further be consolidated later by the Nubian rulers King Shebitku and King Shabaka. This period of Egypt's history is also known as the Napatan period or the Nubian period. King Pi died after 31 years of rule and was buried close to Napata in Nubia within a pyramid. He is remembered as a diplomatic ruler and patient military tactician.
Rome and Nubia, The Forgotten War, Part 1, Introduction. Egypt lies in ruins. Alexandria has fallen, and thousands of Roman sandals now walk the banks of the Nile, consolidating the gains of Caesar Augustus. Egypt, as it had been known for thousands of years, was no more. Cleopatra Philopatra VII lies dead, killed by her own hand in an effort to spite her enemies and deprive them of their trophy. Another queen beyond the southern border looks north at the smoldering ashes of her nation's longtime rivals and sighs deeply. The winds of war were blowing south, and the all-consuming beast that was Roman imperial ambition set its sights on the gold, ivory, and other coveted goods that streamed north from this ancient empire. Kush, however, and their warrior queen Amanirenas were not interested in submitting to foreign rule. The drums of war would soon beat in the hearts of Nubia's warriors. The only question was when. What we are talking about is the almost forgotten war between Rome and Nubia that immediately followed the fall of Cleopatra's Egypt, which was the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and it finally closed the book on Egypt's ancient civilization as it had been known for thousands of years. Unfortunately, the sources that we have on the events that took place following the fall of Egypt are not Nubian. This is not for the lack of written sources, but more so due to the fact that the language of the Kushites is lost to us. Meroitic, as it is now called, used many of the same character letters found in the various scripts used by the Egyptians, and even their languages, both being Afro-Asiatic, were similar. However, we have yet to uncover a Rosetta Stone that will crack the code for all of us and tell us about the lives of the Kushites in their own words. For now, we have accounts of the war from Strabo, which detail the conflict as well as the artifacts found in Meroe, the old capital of the Kingdom of Kush. End of Part 1. Rome and Nubia, The Forgotten War, Part 2, Background and Politics. In order to properly understand what led to this conflict, we have to start several years earlier with the death of Julius Caesar and the subsequent fallout. Julius Caesar was crowned Emperor of Rome and was killed on March 15, 44 BCE on the steps of the Roman Senate by high-ranking members of the Roman elite. This included Marcus Junius Brutus, Cassius Longinus, and Decimus Brutus. This led to a crisis of leadership as there was no clear plan to follow up after the assassination, and Julius Caesar still had powerful supporters, among them being Mark Antony, who was a powerful politician and military commander, Cleopatra, his former lover and the Queen of Egypt, and Octavian, his heir, grandnephew, and adopted son, who was a young but emerging political leader. After much political wrangling, the dust had finally settled, and Octavian, later called Caesar Augustus, renamed in 27 BCE, took over rule of the Roman Empire. He still had to contend, however, with Mark Antony, who used his political clout to make Caesar Augustus's rule difficult. Mark Antony made claims to leadership of regions like Cisalpine Gaul, and even tried to rouse the Roman public against Caesar Octavian in open rebellion. In the end, they settled on making peace by dividing the empire into a new triumvirate. Rule of the empire was to be divided between Caesar Augustus, who controlled Gaul, Hispania, and the Alps, Mark Antony, who controlled Greece, Anatolia, Cyrene, and Asia Minor, and Lepidus, who controlled the provinces of Africa. All other areas were ruled collectively by the triumvirate. Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, saw this chaos as an opportunity to break from Rome and seek full autonomy. While Egypt was not officially considered part of the Roman Empire, it was a lucrative client state, a legacy passed down to Cleopatra by way of debts incurred by her predecessors. Control of Egypt meant access to grain, papyrus production, and luxury goods hotly desired by the Roman elite. This included pelts, precious gems, and the like from kingdoms south of Egypt, like Kush and the city-states of Punt, access to trade goods like silk imported from as far as India that came in by sea, and many other goods that were not easily accessible or produced in the Mediterranean. Using the wealth produced by Egypt, Cleopatra helped to fund some of Mark Antony's military campaigns against the will of the other two-thirds of the triumvirate. Eventually, she and Mark Antony, through their close political relationship, eventually became lovers. And then they married, after, of course, Antony's divorce to his Roman wife. After a series of offenses by the couple, some real and others imagined, against the Senate and the spirit of Rome, Octavian declared the final war of the Roman Republic. While much of this war did take place in Egypt, it was less a war against Egypt and more so a war between Octavian and Mark Antony. After the Roman victories at Actium and finally the Battle of Alexandria in 30 BCE, Egypt was declared a Roman province. This shifted the balance of power in the region. Egypt had long been a buffer state and trade zone between Kush and the Roman Empire. Now that their longtime rival had fallen for the last time, never to rise again, Queen Amanirenas had work to do. The Kushites, throughout their history, were famed for the quality of soldiers that they produced. For millennia, mercenaries from Kush were found in depictions fighting in the armies of the pharaohs. Many of them had risen to high ranks in the Egyptian army, and they even ruled Egypt during the 26th dynasty. The soldiers that they produced were well respected for their size, strength, and skill with the bow. This tradition of skilled archery carried on into the Islamic conquest, where al-Baduri referred to them as the pupil smiters for their uncanny ability to successfully target the eyes of their enemies with their bows from a significant distance. But that, however, is a story for another time. Their queen, Amanirenas, her full title in Meroitic being Amanirse Kore Likidwe Li, meaning Amanirenas, Queen, and Kandaka, ruled Kush from 40 BCE until her death in 10 BCE. Because we are as yet unable to translate Meroitic script beyond the names of people and places, there is much that is unknown about her early life. What she is most famous for, however, is leading her armies from the front against a Roman invasion in a bloody 5-year war, and emerging victorious. End of Part 2. Rome and Nubia, The Forgotten War, Part 3, The War. The war between Rome and Nubia did not immediately follow the fall of Egypt. Initially, there was a peace deal struck in which Rome promised not to invade Kush so long as they paid tribute. Queen Amanirenas begrudgingly signed this agreement, not wanting to plunge her nation into war. Despite Kush's reputation for producing some of the finest warriors of their time, Rome was still far larger, and regardless of which way a war went, it would be costly. Unrest grew in the Roman province of Egypt, specifically in Thebes, as Rome increased taxes to pay for the expenses incurred fighting Mark Antony, and also to fund military expeditions into Arabia. Despite its agreement with Kush, Rome expressed interest in annexing the Kushite territory of Wadi al-Aki in order to access the gold mines of the region. Tensions were further exacerbated by the Romans imposing taxes on Lower Nubia, which was also in contravention to the treaty. The saber-rattling began, and the Nubians, as a show of strength in response to the Roman breaches to the treaty, started to send raiding parties across the Egyptian border. In one account of the war, it was said that Queen Amanirenas sent a bundle of golden arrows to Caesar Augustus, saying that he could accept them as a token of friendship, and if he still chose to go to war, that he could keep them, because he was going to need them. The raids and passive-aggressive threats of violence would not deter Octavian's resolve to take Nubia. Only blood, iron, and fields of human carrion could change that. Early on in the preliminary border conflicts, her husband, King Tetricus, was killed on the battlefield, leaving Queen Amanirenas and her son, Prince Akinidad, to lead the armies. In 27 BCE, early on in the war, the Kushites had made great advances, going as far north as Thebes and Cyrene, sacking the cities and taking untold numbers of Roman soldiers as prisoners. Most famously, they pulled down statues of Caesar Augustus, keeping the head of one of these statues as a prize to be buried under the queen's throne as a sign of her power and as a sign of disrespect to Caesar Augustus. The head was found in the 19th century during an excavation of the ruins of Meroe, buried under the foot of the queen's throne. In response, Rome sent thousands of reinforcements led by General Aelius Petronius, and initially tried to set terms with the Mannarinas at Dacia. The terms of peace were not accepted, and the war continued. The Roman army pressed into northern Kush, and then besieged the city of Napata. Amid the flames, gladius and battle-axe crossed. Thundering horses came against trumpeting war elephants. Spears, pilums, and arrows fell from the sky in every direction. The ancient temples of the religious capital of the kingdom of Kush were burned to ashes, and among those laid low was the queen's own son, Prince Akinidad. From Napata, the Roman army marched on Meroe, meeting stiff resistance from the Kushite forces stationed at the fortresses between the two cities. The march towards the Kushite capital was not completed, and the Roman army had to pull back into less hostile territory and set up an encampment at Qasr Ibrim. In typical Roman fashion, Petronius had the camp well defended, with quickly built fortifications and well-positioned ballistae, making assault on that position on top of the hill he was stationed a near-suicide mission. That being said, Queen Mannarinas had so arrayed her army of many thousands of men in such a way that further advance from the Roman army would not be possible. And so the stalemate ensued. End of Part 3. Rome and Nubia, The Forgotten War, Part 4, Conclusion. Wanting this foreign army out of her lands more than anything else, the queen sent envoys to Petronius, who then forwarded them to Caesar Augustus. In 22 BCE, an agreement was struck on the island of Samos between Rome and Kush. Kush would pay to Rome what tributes were owed before the war, and pay compensation for sacking the towns of Upper Egypt. In exchange, Rome returned all of the Kushite land that was captured during the conflict, and trade relations were re-established. Kush would remain fully independent and was no longer required to pay tribute to Rome in exchange for its sovereignty. Relations would remain largely peaceful between the two nations, and Kush used the wealth it gained through its trade relationship with Rome to rebuild the city of Napata, and remained an important political player in the region until
King Taharqa. The Nubian Empire was established in 4800 BC. The Nubian Empire was located in northeastern Africa in the area which is today known as Sudan. Now by 744 BC, the Nubian Empire has successfully conquered their neighbors, namely the Great African Empire of Egypt. This initial conquest was led by the Nubian king Pi, who established Nubia in the seat of power as the 25th dynasty of Egypt. As a consequence, the Great African Empire now controlled both Nubia and Egypt. King Pi had 4 wives, one of which was the Nubian queen Abad. Queen Abad went by other titles, including Lady of Upper and Lower Egypt and Mistress of the Foreign Lands, and she bore a son named Taharqa. Taharqa rose to become king in 690 BC. One of the great artworks created by the Nubians in his honor is the Sphinx of Taharqa, a statue constructed of gray granite where King Taharqa is depicted as a lion. And so, once established in the seat of power, King Taharqa embarked on an ambitious building program across Egypt. The king constructed 4 gateways at the Karnak temple complex, located in Upper Egypt. He also added to the already beautiful Jebel Barkal temple and built new sanctuaries across Nubia. He erected monuments in Thebes and Tanis in Lower Egypt, and he built a number of important temples in Nubia. By becoming a builder king, Taharqa established his pharaonic credentials, and he enjoyed peace and prosperity during the first half of his reign. Under his rule, the influence of Egypt expanded into the Levant area, which includes modern-day Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, Palestine, and the island of Cyprus in Europe. From these areas, the great King Taharqa would secure commodities such as cedar and juniper wood. King Taharqa became one of the most powerful and well-renowned kings in world history. This great African king is also mentioned in the holy book of Christians, named the Bible, in 2 Kings chapter 19, verse 9. The king came to the aid of the nearby Jewish kingdom of Judah in modern-day Israel when they were being attacked by the nation of Assyria, which was located in modern-day Iraq. Indeed, the Bible details King Taharka's preparation for war with the king of Assyria. King Taharka crushed the Assyrians in a battle in the city of El Teke in Israel, and this would start a series of ongoing wars between Egypt and Assyria over many years. Taharka died in the Egyptian city of Thebes and was succeeded by the Nubian ruler named Tantamani. He is remembered as a great African king and strong military leader.
The Nubian pharaohs, just £16 through bibliophilebooks.com. These are the black kings of the Nile from modern-day Sudan. About 190 colour illustrations in this. Absolutely fantastic. It follows a discovery in recent years by a Swiss archaeological team of 7 monumental black granite statues. They portrayed 5 pharaonic rulers, including Tarka and Tanutaman, the last 2 pharaohs of the Nubian dynasty, when Egypt was ruled by kings from the lands of modern-day Sudan. The 7 statues, with their exquisite workmanship, transform our understanding of this period. 190 colour photographs, plans and a scholarly text. A welcome addition to Egyptologists' libraries at just £16.
Egypt has always traditionally been given prominence as the height of ancient culture. Nubia is now coming into its own and is being understood to be of equal importance. It is different from ancient Egypt, but it is equally important and not just an adjunct to this Egyptian culture. What archaeologists do when they pull material from the ground or when they translate texts, they bring their own cultural baggage to that interpretation and the baggage of the times that they live in. And so it's imperative that we go back and continually reassess the things that we take as facts. Many of the early archaeologists came to the study of ancient Egypt and ancient Nubia from the perspective of Semitic languages or the study of the Hebrew Bible, and it was very important to them to bring Egypt specifically into the sphere of biblical studies. And so they had to carve Egypt away from Africa to bring it into that sphere. And the way that they did that was they used race. So these early archaeologists effectively made ancient Egypt white in the sense that they made it part of a dominant Western culture, and ancient Nubia was separated from that. It was black. And this was how they took Egypt out of Africa and put it into this Semitic sphere, this biblical sphere. And it's only in recent decades, the last 3-4 decades, that Egyptology has really moved away from that. And scholars who are studying Nubia are really given the chance to give a voice to this Nubian material that it wasn't given much of a chance to have in the past. Someone asks me, what was the ancient Egyptians' view of X? I immediately think of a two-pronged view, because the ancient Egyptians had an official view of many things, and this is the view that would be put up on the walls of temples and on the walls of the tombs of the elites. That was an official, let's say, state-sanctioned view. That bore little to no resemblance to what people actually may have thought. It was the official view. So when you look at Nubia as depicted on the walls of temples in Egypt, you will see Nubians being crushed under the chariot wheels of the king. You will see Nubians being dragged back to Egypt enslaved. What we see on the ground in terms of archaeological evidence is quite different. We see people who had Nubian names, people who were using Nubian material culture, living within Egypt, working in Egypt, marrying people with Egyptian names. So something quite different from the very intense militaristic scenes that you see in temples. When George Reisner excavated Kerma, he found the statue, a large, beautiful statue of Senui, and also a statue partially destroyed of Jaffa Happy, her husband. It was a very large tomb, and with size in Egypt and in Nubia, we tend to assume ruler or someone very important, which usually translates to ruler. We now understand, yes, this was a ruler's tomb. It is a completely different time period than Jaffa Happy and Senui lived in. Much later, we understand it to be a local ruler, so it was a Kerman official who, for reasons we can guess at, brought or had these two statues brought to Kerma and put in his tomb. It could have been an appropriation of Egyptian culture in general, just to show that, yes, I can own these things that are Egyptian wonderful works of art. Because what we're saying, if you read between the lines, is whoever owns these statues is a powerful person. And that means this art has power.